Welcome in to the Rock Talk Studio, the place to find your next great rock and roll book or documentary. This is the podcast that reviews, previews, and most importantly, recommends to you the good stuff. Like today's book about four young men who took a trip to New York City and changed rock and roll forever. I'm your host, Big Rick. Join me for an exclusive look into what's hitting the shelves and the screens, and get ready to rock your reading and viewing list. And today, the spotlight falls on the new documentary about the Beatles' first trip to the United States and the day that literally changed rock and roll. The doc is called Beatles 64, and it's produced by Martin Scorcese and directed by David Tedeschi. Probably one of the most meaningful days in the history of rock and roll, February 9, 1964. And though if you don't recognize the date, you will definitely remember what happened. The Beatles played the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, and 73 million people watched. So how did Scorsese and Tedeschi do with this doc on a subject most who follow rock and roll are very aware of? Well, they took a few different roads to get there. Four, actually. And one of the more interesting paths they took jumpstarts the doc and stood out right from the beginning, and that was putting a cultural stamp on the Beatles' arrival. I thought the beginning of the film with a cultural introduction was perfect. It tied the film or the Beatles' arrival into where everybody's mind was after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and how the Beatles took the American people's minds and their hearts to a better place. Beatles' popularity in part was because, as one fan says in the movie, they turned the lights back on. Big props for exploring this angle. It really made you step back and realize the timing of this. I've never heard or read anything that looked at the significance of the Beatles arriving to America during this bleak time of mourning and bringing with them all this youthful joy that the country so desperately needed, especially the youth. It was really well done and a great start and kickoff to this documentary. And that leads me to the second road or theme that stood out to me, and that was the youth of the Beatles. Because they used film from Albert and David Maysles, who were granted behind-the-scenes access to the Beatles as they traveled around, you get to witness the whirlwind that they stepped into and how kind of just wide-eyed and just happy they were just to be in America. Really great footage of the Beatles as they hung out at the Plaza Hotel in New York while the crowds just grew crazy outside. There is some fantastic footage of them attending a party at the British Embassy, and you just get to witness how they were just having a lot of fun and doing their best to soak it all in while all around them this craziness swirled. And at times, watching this, I kind of got whiplash because it was just so fast-paced and jumped around from all that was happening. And remember, they were only there for 2 weeks this first time they came. The third standout point was the music, no doubt. And instead of making the Ed Sullivan appearance the focal point, the documentary gives you complete songs from much rarer shows. The Washington, D.C. concert they did in a boxing ring, and this was a huge standout of this documentary. The remix of the sound and the performances are remarkable, especially there's a cut of Paul McCartney doing Long Tall Sally, and you get rock and roll gold with this really rare footage. Another thing done real well was the usage of footage of interviews with George and Paul from later years. It was a nice look back from both of them. And it was also kind of a cool touch because Ringo and Paul both did interviews, especially for this documentary. And including clips from George and John talking about the trip, it just felt right and really worked well in the doc. Even though the cameras were tightly focused on the Beatles, Scorsese used a wide lens to tell this story. There is actually 17 minutes worth of new footage that never has been seen before from the original film the Maysles shot. And though there are a lot to digest in this documentary, the real star is the video that was shot. I mean, it is incredible. It's so impressive what was captured and how it was captured. This was an intense 2-week period in musical and cultural history. And the Beatles' first trip to the United States left America in the first wave of Beatlemania. It's nice to have this Beatles artifact to look back on, especially the film from the Maysles brothers. Beatles 64, great doc, check it out. So now it's time for the one big question, And the one big question is me taking a step back and trying to look at this like if I was just sitting there and you and I were watching this documentary, what would be the big standout question? And after we're watching it, we look at each other and we say, why the was this guy in the documentary? Before I answer that one big question, I got a question for you. Did you get December's Rock Talk Studio Blast? You know, the email that goes out on the last Friday of the month that gives you everything you need to know about the world of rock and roll books and documentaries, the top 5 titles of the year, the latest announcements about titles for 2025, and a chance to win a free book that landed in the top 5 rock and roll books of the year? If the answer is no, I can help you out with that. It's easy. Just send me an email at info@rocktalkstudio.com and say, Big Rick, send me the blast, and I'll hook you up. And I'll also enter you in to win the free book. Okay, what was Sonata Maitreya doing in the Beatles 64 doc? Who is Sonata Maitreya? He is formerly known as Terence Trent D'Arby. Remember him? 1987 debut, big deal at the time. And he's included in this documentary, which is a very interesting choice because I just don't get it at all. He doesn't say anything bad. He's very positive, but they've got David Lynch in here, and he attended the Washington, D.C. show. So you've got that perspective, the one in the boxing ring, and he just really went deep, and his exploration of the power in music and how it was like nothing he'd ever seen before really lent itself to the documentary. You got Ronnie Spector, who snuck the Beatles out of the Plaza Hotel and took them to Harlem to eat soul food, added a ton to this documentary. And Smokey Robinson, who was also included, was really great. The Beatles were the first white band he'd ever heard speaking about getting their inspiration from black music and artists, and they covered his song on their first record, You've Really Got a Hold on Me. So those 3 people added a ton. Terence Trent D'Arby, or Sonata Maitreya, as he's called now, again, I didn't get it. It didn't hurt the doc. It just seemed really out of place. So again, like it didn't do anything bad to the documentary. The interview is really positive, and it doesn't make me not recommend the doc in any way. It just really stood out to me and had me questioning why this guy was included. A little side note about Terence Trent D'Arby I do want to mention. When he first came out that first year, I saw him at the Palladium in Hollywood, and he came out ripping. He had a leather jacket on, no shirt underneath it, and he opened the concert with Jumpin' Jack Flash, and he was a mix of James Brown, Prince, Mick Jagger. He was everything at that time. I thought this guy was going to be huge. I loved him. He had a moment, and that was it. So I do got to say props to Terence Trent D'Arby, and props to you for sneaking into the Beatles 64. Coming up next week is a review of a movie. I think the first time I've ever reviewed a movie on the Rock Talk Studio podcast. And this movie is near and dear to my heart. And I have taken my time with this review because I really have to make sure that I'm coming from a different place, because this movie is about my favorite artist of all time, someone I've been enjoying for over 40 years. And that's the new Bob Dylan movie, A Complete Unknown. So next week, I'm going to give you my heartfelt, deepest exploration of that film. And I have to admit, this was not an easy review to write for me, but I promise to you, I'm not going to get all fanboy on you. I'm not going to go crazy Dylan on you. I'm just going to give you a very, very deep overview of what I thought about A Complete Unknown. But I do want to mention there's some other great shows that just came out over the holidays. I just did the top 10 rock and roll books and the rock and roll documentaries from 2024, and also the award-winning rock and roll books and documentaries of 2024. You can catch that in the archives for free. Just back a couple of shows. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Love talking rock and roll and being able to give you a scoop on a title I think is worth your time and money. If you want to get in on that free book that I was talking about that I'm giving away this month, that book is Chris Stein's memoir, Chris Stein from Blondie. The book is called Under a Rock. Again, all you have to do is enter to win is send me over your email at info@Rock Talk Studio. I'll put it in the show notes also. All right, folks, tear it down, pack it up, and head on down the road. We'll see you next time in the Rock Talk Studio.